that will be giving you the information today as I ask them questions. First here is Stephen Reeves. Stephen comes from around this Abilene area, I think more so towards the Anson area a little bit, as he has family that's connected in this part of the world. Some of you may have earlier met Stephen because he worked for the Christian Life Commission of the Baptist General Convention of Texas. This is an organization for the Baptist General Convention of Texas that is in Austin, and they do a lot of work with the legislature and other politicians that are there at the state level regarding public policy here in Texas. And then recently, Stephen joined with us the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and so now he is located in Decatur, Georgia, where our national offices are, and he is working with advocacy for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And he'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go on. And then Anara Kano. Anara is a graduate of BUA and recently finished from Dallas Baptist University as well. So she's connected with two of the schools that are out here as well. And she is working with Stephen, working in Texas with churches here in Texas on payday lending. And so they're both partners working together. And so she's going to be talking to us some about things that are going on here in Texas and the issues that are involved there. So what we're going to do is I'll ask them some questions, and then they're going to respond, and then we're going to have time for you to ask questions at the end as well. Our plans are to go from 2 until 3:15, and then when 3:15 comes, Taylor back here, raise your hand, Taylor. So Taylor is taking y'all to your next meeting location, and he'll let you know what to do. But we'll be in here from 2 until 3:15, and I hope you get some good practical information that can help you today. So let's get started. Stephen, I want to begin with you. What do you hope to accomplish with the advocacy work that you're now doing with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship?
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I always like any chance to come home to Texas, so good to be back at Logsdon. And I appreciate the question. I think for Cooperative Baptist, this is the first time in the last 2 years or so that we've had an organized advocacy effort on the national level. And for us, that means as a group of Baptists and churches who are committed to loving the most neglected and marginalized people all across the world for 25 years now in our mission work, what does it look like to be advocates for those same populations? Starting with missions, starting with the people that we encounter, whether it's globally across the world or in our local congregations, how do we raise a voice on their behalf and make a difference? What does the voice of the church and the public witness look like? And we want to really just help folks as they feel called to advocacy, as they feel a need to speak out on people's behalf. We want to encourage and equip folks with the knowledge and strategies to do that, and to help them become more effective advocates. While this position may be kind of new for our organization, there are folks out there either on the mission field or in churches, pastors who have been advocates for people in their community for a long time within CBF Life. How do we really just increase that effectiveness, and how do we kind of raise their voice? And also, how do we connect people to one another? This work can sometimes be tiring, and you can get cynical if you're talking about things that impact the public sphere. So how do we network together? You know, CBF is a very loose network. We have a term, the Denama network, so we're not quite the traditional convention structure. And that includes, we don't do things like resolutions where we vote for majority and then say, okay, we're going to take this official position on any one topic or any one issue. We don't operate that way, so it's more important to be listening to our pastors, our churches, and our communities, and our missionaries, our field personnel, and then give guidance and support to what they're doing, connect them to one another, connect them to maybe some trusted advocates and trusted experts maybe on a particular issue, And then certainly at times promote opportunities to say, hey, it looks like a lot of our people are really concerned about a particular issue, whether it's homelessness or mental health or criminal justice reform or payday lending. And so as we hear that, as we get a sense of issues that may near a consensus of concern, we want to be very specific and say, here, this is how you can make a difference in that area. So we're not talking about passing resolutions and trying to get everybody in lockstep on the same position. We are not trying to select issues and mandate it, because first of all, that's a just futile attempt from a Baptist church. You can't tell anybody to do anything. So we're not going to try and mandate people to take on certain issues, and we are certainly not asking people to get involved in partisan politics. This isn't about supporting or opposing people in a campaign. First of all, the IRS does not like that as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and on top of that, it's a pretty terrible idea to endorse or oppose candidates in the church setting. In most of our churches, we certainly have people that fall across the political spectrum. And so while we want to raise a voice and raise awareness of how maybe people are impacted in the community on an issue, that doesn't mean we're going to say, and so you should vote for this person or not vote for this person. That's a very different thing. And as I'm talking to folks and trying to encourage people to kind of maybe step into this area, I think I like to make a very big distinction and say that advocacy as mission is about people and policies, not about politics. It's about solving problems and addressing needs and not winning at all costs, which unfortunately is many times what politics is about. And sometimes the public sphere is more about politics than actually governing and solving problems. So we want to help folks figure out how, even in the church context, we can do that in a more positive way that's not divisive.
Okay. How do you encourage churches to become involved in advocacy work? And what would be some of, I would say, the very practical things, like what are the do's, the don'ts? What have you learned through this process, Stephen, that makes churches most effective of trying to shape public policy, whether it's something that the city's doing or maybe the state or even on a national level?
That's a really good question, because there are certainly ways to go wrong, to do this in a way that is not positive. But I think the number one thing that I tell pastors or other church members is start with the mission work of the church. Most likely, if your church is like so many other churches, and certainly in CBF Life, they're heavily invested in the community. They are working in the mission realm in a number of ways, whether it's a food pantry at the church, maybe it's providing mentors to the local congregation or local school, maybe it's financial literacy classes. There are a number of ways that most churches want to do good in their community. And I say start there, see where the passion is at your church. If your church has been partnering with a local elementary school, providing mentors for 15 years, maybe it's time to have a conversation with the principal and say, what are the issues going on here? How can we be a better voice for you and for this school in maybe a little bit different way? So I think first and foremost, we say start with the mission work of the church. I think it is also about creating the space and the opportunity for folks within the church who feel called or passionate about a particular issue to feel like they can do that at church, that it's a place that encourages public service, that encourages educated membership, and encourages kind of an active, educated faith. It's amazing some of the stories I've already heard doing this work of payday lending, where people, before their pastor mentioned it, didn't have any idea what was going on, and then they become very strong advocates for their community. And so it's, in some ways, it's about giving permission, more or less, for people to say, look, we want to care about this world beyond the four walls of this church. We want to impact our community with a positive witness for Christ and what that looks like to love our neighbors in public. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that, and kind of give folks permission to think about that from that term within the church. And so again, this work of advocacy is very relational. And so some of the concrete do's: go meet an elected official, know who are elected to represent you and maybe your house and the church. And that doesn't mean the president or the senator or even the congressman, but maybe the mayor and the city council member. The church should be a leader in the community and know where leaders in the community are. And so sit down and have a cup of coffee and say, hey, I'm at this church, and I just want to let you know that, we're praying for you. We know you have a hard job. What are some things you're facing? Let me tell you about what we're seeing in our church. Start by just getting to know people who are decision makers in the community. And I also say, look to partner with other organizations. Sometimes the church can get very siloed, where we do this and this is what we do, and we don't know the church next door, or we don't know the nonprofit that works on mental health, or we don't know the nonprofit that works on homelessness, or any other number of issues. Build relationships within the community outside the walls of the church. I would also say kind of dig deeper when it comes to missions. So if you are serving a certain population, get to know them in a deeper level. Ask those next questions. Why are you here every week with this kind of help? Maybe, why are you here with needing a light bill? And maybe if you ask the right questions, in this case, you might find that they're stuck in a payday loan, and that's really unjust, and maybe the church should say something about that. But also protect the integrity of the church. If your church is known as being an active part of the community and a community leader, at some point someone's going to say, wonderful, now they can take up my issue, and let me tell you, do this and do that. You got to say, no, this is our church, and we are called to do certain things, and we have people that are passionate about certain things, but we're not going to kind of turn over the keys to a political organization or a nonprofit organization. There has to be some boundaries there. I think some do nots. Do not start with politics. Ever. Don't talk about what you heard on Fox News or MSNBC last night, or what Obama did or did not do. That will devolve very, very quickly. So that's not what we're asking. I think we need to start, first of all, with Scripture. What did Jesus tell us to care about? Let's start with that list. That's pretty heavy as it is. Let's start by talking to our community members and putting a face on something. This is not, again, about, just, hey, let's pick some issue that we heard about. This is Bob, and he is at our church asking for a bus pass again because the transit system is terrible in this town. What can maybe we do to improve that, for example? So humanize it. Humanize issues, and don't just start with something abstract. And then I also suggest people maybe look at internationally. A lot of times we have churches that love to go halfway across the globe to work on something that's a problem 2 blocks away. And so think about that, whether it's environmental degradation. You hear stories about things happening in other countries. Well, sometimes that's here. The Flint water crisis is a pretty great example of that. How many churches do y'all know that have dug wells halfway across the world? We're concerned about the water quality in the colonias on the border, which, yes, we should. But right here in our own country, things are sometimes troubling too. But if you look at it from an international perspective, you can maybe bring a different frame. Obviously, if you get to work and talking about these issues, act like a Christian. That sounds really simple, but if you look at kind of how public debate happens in this country, you realize that is a pretty radical notion. Don't demonize or embrace win at all costs. Really, if you're going to bring your committed Christian self and your what your beliefs have taught you, do so in a Christ-like manner, and that sometimes is harder and easier said than done.
Thank you, Stephen. Let's focus in to sort of putting some of these principles that you've laid out for us here. Let's look at payday lending, and we'll use that as a case study for the rest of the time of what advocacy could look like. And so CBF has already been involved, I know, in some of the payday lending because of the materials that you've sent out to me. But I'm not for sure that maybe everybody here knows exactly what payday lending is and the problems that it can create in communities and in individuals' lives. So give us a sort of a crash course, a payday lending 101 type of presentation of what is payday lending and the impact that it has.
Thanks. That's a good question because we got to make sure everybody's kind of starting at the same place. Raise your hand if when we say payday or auto title lending, you know what we're talking about. All right, pretty educated bunch, but not universal. I first started looking at this issue in 2009 in Texas, and from a very policy standpoint, right? I was working at this organization I was a registered lobbyist, and like, what do we need to do with the law and that sort of thing. And as I started this to educate myself and then educate others, there were kind of two responses I got. The first one was, I have no idea what that is. I see those locations, they're kind of like pawn shops. I figure it's kind of a ripoff, but I have no idea. And the other is, I know exactly what you're talking about. Let me tell you what happened to my son, my brother, my friend in Sunday school. But when that first group hears about what really goes on, the next question I get is, how is that legal? How in the world could that be legal? And so to break it down in its simplest terms, it's usury. How many of y'all have heard the term usury from the pulpit in the last month? That's exactly how many I thought. 0. It's an old term that we don't hear much anymore, but it is an old biblical, Old Testament term, and that just means charging excessive interest. These are small dollar loans, typically $300 to $500 for a payday loan, maybe $1,200 for an auto title loan. And the idea is that it's going to be the folks who come to these places maybe don't feel like they have many other choices, and they're going to go get a loan that they know is probably expensive, but they don't really recognize how it works. And when you look at the interest rate on a yearly basis, we're talking about 400% interest, 500, 700% interest. Most of us get upset if our credit card goes over like 22% interest. If y'all had 500% interest student loans, you think you're not getting out of them now. Y'all are like, what, 4 or 6% maybe at the most. This is charging excessive interest, particularly to people who are vulnerable, who feel like they maybe don't have any other choice. And so the root morality of this is, if people feel stuck and unable to find money any other way, they're going to be desperate to sign something that is maybe not in their best interest. And so historically there was a very strong prohibition against charging excessive interest to these folks, because people can take advantage of them. If you're in a desperate situation, and then you can get taken advantage of. And so throughout history, this has been kind of a common morality. You can obviously look at the Old Testament. Dante in the Inferno, you should look that up. He does not have a very high opinion of usurers. This is a very old concept that held strong in the U.S. for a long time, where when we were established as a country, it was 8%, 13%, maybe 10%. And then for a while it was about 36%. And now what we've seen over the last 20 years or so is an erosion of the traditional morality of usury, so that some of the smallest, supposedly short-term loans are the highest cost for those who can afford it the least. The result is that most folks, when they go to a payday lender and they show them, I get paid, here's my check stub, or I get Social Security, or I get disability, here's how much I get paid. They give automatic access to their checking account, and they're supposed to come back in 2 weeks and pay off the loan. So a $300 loan might cost $360, $375, which already sounds expensive, but for some folks they feel like, okay, I can do this. But what happens again and again is people either come in and they can't pay $375 in one chunk, and so they pay $75, and you know how much that reduces what they owe? By 0. It does nothing. It just buys them 2 more weeks. And so they are put in a situation of payments never ever reducing what they owe. Or they come in and they do pay it. They pay $375 because they just got paid. But guess what? Now that hole in their budget means they're not going to make it 2 more weeks to the next payday. And so they end up getting another one. And so for a lot of people, if this was just an expensive loan, if this worked as advertised, it would be unfortunate, but I don't think it would cause the moral outrage that it does. Studies show that it works in the way it's advertised for about 13% of the population. So only, a little over maybe 13 people out of 100 will go in, they'll take out a loan, and 2 weeks later they'll pay it off and they'll be done. For the vast majority of folks, one way or another, they're going to get stuck. And the folks who give people these loans know that. And so they're basically getting paid again and again and again for not doing anything. And so we have seen this happening in states across the country. And for CBF, first starting in Texas, but now also people in Kentucky, in Louisiana, in Alabama, in Missouri, CBF pastors and churches have been concerned about this for years. And so we've been working at the state level to make this policy better. And then also now at the federal level, a new agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has the opportunity to write a rule or national regulation that could improve this for the entire country. And so CBF as an organization is putting a lot of resources and time into educating folks and helping them understand how they can be better advocates on this issue in a way that is going to make a difference across the entire country. So as much as I said right then, we can talk a lot more about it. It can sometimes seem very complicated, but the simple truth is this is taking advantage of those most vulnerable in our state. Texas has no limit whatsoever what can be charged. I saw a contract for an auto title loan where a man had gotten $4,000 and was not really explained the terms and how this worked, would pay $1,200 a month and never reduce what he owed. So there's a moral line to business, to commerce, and I think it's the church's job to point out when it's been crossed. And if you can't think that a $4,000 loan paying $1,200 a month all year long and never reducing what you owe is wrong, you need to check something, because that's just exploitation. And I think we can do something better here in the state.
Anira, you and your husband serve in a church in Fort Worth, Texas. What have you observed going on in your community that you serve, or maybe even among some of your own church members regarding payday loan issues?
Well, thank you for having me here, and it's actually a really sad dilemma. You see them everywhere, especially when you start learning about them, and you see them, but you don't think anything of them. You think, oh, that's for somebody, or that must, I don't know what that is, until you're confronted with someone close to you in your congregation who really has been victimized by one of these places. And specifically, I wanted to share a story of one of our members of our church. She found herself in a bind, her and her family, and she couldn't think of anywhere else to go. She had already asked for help from family members. She had already asked for help in other ways from other people. And so she decided to go to one of these auto title loan companies. And there, she gave her auto title. Later, she kept trying to pay it off. Every time she attempted to pay it off, she just couldn't pay it. They make it seem very easy for you to pay off in 2 weeks. However, that's not the case, as Stephen was explaining to you. Every time she would go back and could not pay for it, she had to extend her loan. And if she did finish paying one, she had already taken others to help cover this loan. She was afraid of going back to her husband, and so she kept this, under the carpet per se, to the point where she was no longer paying her mortgage. And eventually, she lost her house. And she came to us at that time, to my husband and I, who are her pastors. And it was a devastating time where my husband and I tried to do whatever we knew, what we could, talking to lawyers, talking to the banks, trying to save her house. But it had already been sold. At that time, she told us, if I don't pay off this loan, or if I don't find help to pay off some of these payments, I'm also going to lose my car. And because it was an auto title loan. And so we had to help her, because if she didn't have a car, she was not going to be able to go to work. These are people who work. They have to have they have to have proof of a pay stub and have to have a checking account where it automatically is drafted from. And she was desperate. And my husband and I, with the church, we helped her get out of that loan, and so that she can save her car and save her job, and not only not have to lose her car as well. Unfortunately, this is one story, right, of so many in my church. That is, things have come up of those who have lost either their cars or aren't able to pay off their bills because they're having to pay off these loans. We were able to, like I said, we were able to help her. And in working with other, part of my job is to help advocate, help bring awareness to churches about these issues. And as I'm talking to people of all kinds of people, I was able to interact with some students, some college students. So speaking about community, I don't want you to feel like this is something so far away from you. I've spoken to college students, one particular from Texas Tech, where she needed money. She needed extra money to buy groceries. She knew that her parents were already stretched with tuition, so she decided to go to get a payday loan. And she thought, okay, well, I'll just extend the loan. And instead of them allowing her to extend the loan, they automatically withdrew the $500 she had asked a loan from, in which she did not have that money. So not only was she stuck with no money, but she also had an overdraft fees. And she continued to go back to this because she continued to think that they were helping her. And so all this I say to share with you that it's very close to home. There's many people in our congregation who have fallen into these predatory loans. I have friends who have as well. So I wanted to share that with you, that it's not far from you. It's in your communities. It's in your church. It's very important that we are the ones that are speaking up, that we're sharing this information with the people in our churches, with our friends in college, with anybody that you minister to or that you work with, that they know, that they're aware of this industry.
What would be concrete things that students could do, for example, to get involved in helping with payday lending things in Texas? What could pastors do that could be helpful in their communities as well? Anera?
Some of the things, as I just shared right now, that you can do specifically is make people aware. They need to know that this industry is not there to help them. It's important that our congregations know about this as well. You can also share with your pastors. Go to your pastors and ask them, do you know about this situation? Ask people that you work with. As Stephen was sharing, if your church has missions, local missions, ask, why is it that you can't meet your light bill every month? Why is it that you keep coming back for help? And you might learn that these are the reasons why, and maybe even help them become aware that they don't need to be going to these industries or these companies. Another way that, as Rick McClatchy shared, is going to your pastors and asking them to be an advocate, to go to legislature, and speak to their city councils, to speak to their senators about the need for us to advocate for the least of these in our communities. These are people who are in need, who are vulnerable, and they're being victimized even more because of this industry. Another way that you can actively help is by collecting stories. The Consumer Finance Bureau Protection is about to come out with a rule. We're hoping soon. We've been waiting. And this rule is to help bring responsibility, bring regulation in regards to how much, or the responsibility of these companies. And so they need stories to back up why they're fighting for this rule. So we need your help, and those who are hurt by this, to say, this is a problem. We need you to please do something about it. So that's one way, is to share stories of your friends, to collect stories from them, or if you know anybody. Another way is make it known on social media. And we're very in tune with social media. Put it out there. There's great articles. I shared with you guys in the front this card. If you go out back, I'm sorry, not in the front. In the foyer, there's these cards. And these give you very practical ways for you to help. And there's some actually great articles that you can read. There's videos out there that you can watch. You can share those on social media. Share them so that your church, so that your friends, your classmates are aware of these issues.
I want to mention one other thing, and that is the degree to which there is agreement on this issue across political and religious boundaries. So again, as we're thinking about things that a church or Christian might raise their voice and advocate on behalf of, so many times we're worried about politics, left versus right, or religious folks. Catholics do that, not Baptists, or whatever kind of divisions you might have. This is an issue that really crosses boundaries. In the world of politics, in Texas for several sessions now, the bill that the Texas Baptist Christian Life Commission and others have supported was put forward by a Republican. And oftentimes they're anti-business regulation, but many of them have realized that this is a line that's been crossed, and so there's bipartisan agreement in many instances. And then when it comes to the faith community, CBF was very instrumental in organizing the first ever national religious coalition to work on this issue. And along with CBF, the Southern Baptist Convention, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is involved. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is involved. The National Baptist Convention USA, African American Baptist Convention is involved. The National Association of Evangelicals, a rather large organization, is also involved. It is across left and right theological and politically ideological lines that this has really united folks, and so I think that's important.
I've noticed in the news that sometimes this can be attacked even on the city level. I have heard several cities in Texas they were dealing with this issue on the city council level. How does this handle itself legally? Because it sounds like it can be addressed maybe on the national level, a state level, a city level. Explain that piece for us.
Absolutely. This is a really interesting and unique issue. I've worked on these sort of things for 15 years or so, and very rarely do you have active advocacy issues and efforts on the state level at the city council, on the local level at the city council, at the state level in Austin, and in Washington, D.C. at the same time. But basically, after in 2011, we were able to pass some very meager reform. So kind of the first steps for reform in Texas, but not what we were really hoping to. And as a result, several folks in local cities said, well, what can we do? And it just so happens that because the state of Texas does so little, it opens the door for city councils to do something. And so they stepped in, and the main thing that they've been able to do that's helpful is to say, in our city limits, if you're going to offer one of these loans, every time somebody comes back to pay on that loan, instead of just rolling it over and buying more time and not paying down the principal, you have to contribute 25% of that payment to their principal. So in other words, after 4 times, the balance will be 0. that is still a very, very expensive loan, but it's not a forever debt trap. And so now the state of Texas has over 30 cities that have passed this ordinance. And actually, I can't remember if Abilene has one or not. I'm not sure that it does. So any Logsdon folks here, that might be a good project for you. I'm telling you, when you start talking about it, and you get away from the lobbyists and the industry influence at the capitals in Austin or Washington, the people in the city council get it and they see it, and they've been, have been unanimous in several places. And so most recently, Temple and Waco have basically all of the big major cities except for Fort Worth. That's your job. Have passed these, and so they're not the best solution in the world, but it's as much as a city can do, and we're seeing that it is a great way to get folks educated on this issue and support more advocacy, and then turn to the state representatives in the area, Susan King from Abilene, for example, to say, hey, look, this is what we've done at the local level. We've done as much as we can do. Now it's your turn. What are you going to do? And so I encourage folks to really think about the city aspect here as well.
We'd like to hear your questions, and we can take several types of questions. One could be related to payday lending in particular, since we've spent more time looking at that one, and how churches can be involved on multiple levels on this. Or we could talk about advocacy on other issues in general as well. In fact, I'm going to sort of get you started, and I haven't told Taylor this, but Taylor, I want to ask you a question. I know that you worked with a student organization here on campus that was trying to do advocacy on different issues. Would you mind telling about what y'all have done and how y'all have tried to get involved in advocacy here on the campus? And if you want to come up here, you can, or if you'd rather stand back there or talk from there, it's fine. Okay. Go ahead, Reggie.
That's a really good question. So thank you, and thanks for what you're doing here on campus as well. I think to some degree that depends on the issue, but I would say if you're thinking about something that has a national scope, so something like this where the main activity is Congress or Washington, realize that your member of the House has an office in the district, first of all. So that doesn't mean you have to go to Washington. You can set up a meeting and meet with their staff first here in Abilene. I know Nagabar goes all the way to Lubbock, so he probably has an office in each. But I would say that if it's just a handful of folks, let's say there's 2 or 3 of y'all, maybe start with that kind of very informal district meeting. Say that you're concerned about. Say, hey, we've been doing this on campus, and then say what are the issues that they're seeing. Get some information from them, and you may hear, well, there's a committee hearing coming up, or he just doesn't think this is an issue, or you'll get some information that can then lead to next steps. So I would say this too, you would be surprised at how few contacts from constituents it takes for them to start paying attention to an issue. So it may feel like this is so far away and so hard to do, that Washington's a mess and you can't make any difference. You would be surprised at how quickly they start paying attention, especially if you say, I'm a Sunday school teacher, I'm a seminary student, I'm a pastor. If you say, you're invested in the community, in their district, and you have a network and you want to know what is it that the representative thinks, or how can we help the representative be better on this issue? After you have that meeting and you hear back a little bit, it may give you some more ideas. And if you can generate, 20 actual legitimate letters from constituents to an office, that's a pretty significant thing. This isn't click activism, right? This isn't like get how many likes you want to get on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Like this isn't even form email, right? I mean, it might be email, but it's not just blue plate or boilerplate type stuff. This is actual people that have clearly invested their time and energy and a little bit of knowledge into an issue and have written a letter, made contact, and they'll pay attention quicker than you realize, is my experience.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
With my experience, it's a quick question. I would say I've heard I have to make this payment, that I have to make this payment which I can't even pay other bills. I have 2 weeks. I might have to take out another loan. Maybe something I would also say, I'm going to need my title. Things. They seem so basic, but that's as far as friends or colleagues of mine that I've heard them speak about it. Those are the things that they would say. Or even they'll even shy away. They'll be like, I just don't know where else to go.
I think those are great. That's exactly right. I think when if they're already talking to you about it and you're willing to engage, ask them how long they've been making that payment and how much they have left, because the answer might be 6 months and I've not reduced what I owed at all, and that's when you know, right? But you also said, how do you help? And that is really important when it comes to this issue, because as we started talking about mission, you have to be doing both, kind of the charity and the justice, the mission and the advocacy. If someone comes to your church because they're stuck, if you say, don't worry, I've called our congressman, they aren't going to be happy. That is not a response, right? So what are you going to do to actually address the need? And so a lot of churches have pretty sophisticated benevolence, right? That they have a certain amount every month that they're able to just give to folks in need. And I'm going to get back to that in a second. But the other thing, some people have actually come up with alternatives. So if not payday, where, right? We get that question a lot. First of all, where did they go 20 years ago? Because this is pretty new, right? Payday lending is new. This has not been around forever. But what the most successful a lot of churches have done this, and the most successful places I've seen, they have partnered with a local credit union. Credit unions are set up to be more invested in the community. They have pretty tight regulations around these sort of loans, but they have written rules that say, here's what you can charge, and this is and they're so much more reasonable. They're lower rates, they're longer time periods. I had a church from Missouri just 2 weeks ago sent an email and saying, this is our program. And they've pulled a little bit of money from their deacons, and I think it's like $7,000, so it's not a huge amount, but they said, we want to start a fund at the local credit union that is actually literally across the street. I went on Google Maps, and you can look at the church, and then the credit union is right across the street. If someone comes to the church, if they need money, or if they need to get out of a payday loan, they walk with them across the street. They have a bit of a guarantee pool set up that the church has provided, and they give them basically it's a credit card. It's got a limit of $1,000, and it's got a regular credit card interest rate. And with that credit card, they pay off the loan, they keep the credit card on file at the church, and they help that person pay it off in a reasonable manner. That it's a longer term. Instead of 2 weeks, it's going to be 6 months. But they're going to be reasonable payments. And so many of these alternative programs, again, mostly partnering with credit unions, the church provides some coaching, some mentoring, so a little bit of hand-holding to say, let's help make sure you don't get into this again. Let's work with your budget. And in some places, the payments themselves to the credit union, they take a small portion, $20, and start putting it into a savings account. Because that's why folks are going to these places. They don't have $300 saved. And if you look at the statistics about savings in America, they're terrible. So maybe the next time when they need $300, they go to themselves and not somewhere else. And so there's different models out there, but that's been the most important one that I've seen, is a church providing maybe a little bit of backing funds and then some mentoring in partnership with a credit union. And one other thing about benevolence, one of the first times a pastor ever called me about this, he told me the story of a family in his church, came to the church for help with the budget. We're not going to make ends meet. The church said our policy was first time, no questions asked. They gave him whatever money they needed, and they went on their way. Well, they came back again about 2 or 3 months later, and the church said, okay, this time we're going to help you, but we're going to partner you with a deacon, and they're going to sit down and figure out how you can not come back again, why you're here again. And the deacon, after doing that, came back to the pastor and said, well, they can't make ends meet. And the pastor's like, they were doing fine for several months. Why all of a sudden they don't have it? He said, well, they've got a payday loan. It was a $700 loan, and now every 2 weeks they're automatically taking $200 out of his checking account, and none of it's going to pay it off. So he had paid $1,800 on a $700 loan in about 4 or 5 months and still owed $700. The church finally paid it off, had to pay $1,500, so that $700 loan cost over $3,300 in less than 6 months. But the church would have never known that if they didn't have this policy along with their benevolence to sit down and ask the second question, to help out in a more kind of strategic way than just continually handing out benevolence.
A similar thing as Stephen's talked about here in San Antonio, there's a Baptist credit union in San Antonio. What they're wanting to do to add a piece to this is that a lot of times it will be the churches that are in San Antonio. We're still sort of economically segregated. It will be the churches that are in the poor part of town that often will have the members or people that they know in the community that are most susceptible to these type of predatory lending policies. And the problem is many of these churches do not have as much financial resources to help with the setting up an alternative thing like Stephen's talked about. So what they're looking at in San Antonio is to get some of our more suburban congregations that are more affluent, have more financial resources to help with benevolent work, to partner with one of the churches that are in the poorer part of town, and together they work with the Baptist Credit Union to set up an alternative loaning program that can help people get out or not ever get hooked into these kind of predatory lending practices. So even if you're in an affluent part of town and your church is a fairly affluent type of church, you really maybe ought to be looking at, well, who's the church we need to be partnering with? Because they really may have the contacts with the people that are the most affected by this. And so that way you build that personal connection that local church that's in the poorer neighborhood has. And so that may be another thing you think of. Another question you might ask them is, where'd you get this loan? And if they say a bank, then you start to but if it's something that doesn't sound like a bank, you might be a thing to ask.
It's something I'd like to add is I've spoken to some people where they say, well, we're in an affluent church. We don't have that problem at our church. But yet they have a benevolent or a mission department that helps with benevolent funds. And I go back and I say, well, do you know where your funds are going to? And so sadly, some of these benevolent funds are going to pay or to bring business to this industry as opposed to really help someone come out of their problem. And so, yes, it is an issue, even for affluent churches, because their money, it doesn't need to go to these loans. It needs to go to kingdom work.
Other questions? Yes.
Good. I can absolutely send you what I received from the Church of Missouri. That's like 2 pages of how we do this, and that's a pretty good starting place. I haven't asked. Actually, I've got a conversation with a guy on Friday, but I haven't asked, like, are there any MOUs? Have you done some sort of more formal partnership with the credit union? They probably have, but I can send you that and keep you up to date. There are a lot of different kind of models that I've seen. Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, they just bought a credit union, right? I mean, they're a huge like mega church, and so they had those sort of resources. Then there are some people that just have a bigger benevolence, and they kind of do it all within the church. But I think the most successful, to one degree or another, do that kind of partnership. There's somebody in Minnesota, if y'all run across Exodus Lending, in Minneapolis, I think. Grace Period started a while back, and it was in Pennsylvania. I don't know how much success they're having right now, but it's something that people are really working on. And I think I always encourage that, because you have to help people where they are. But I think that it wouldn't be necessary if our laws were just. And so I think the church, there are over 3,200 locations of payday lenders in Texas. Maybe if every single church in Texas started this, there can be some sort of competition. But we are never going to beat them at their own game, making a reasonable, offering a reasonable product. So I always say, yes, figure out how you can help, who you can help, when you can help them, but take some of that energy and also pour it into advocacy. Because as long as these loans are out there and the profits available at these unjust rates, they're going to keep making a whole lot of money off of people.
And of course, the disappointing part is
It's absolutely correct. And I would say that, when I've given kind of longer talks about this to churches, I say that some of the blame needs to go on the churches themselves, particularly if you look at where this is a predominant industry. It's a lot in the South. The Bible Belt is also the usury belt. And this leads right back to Christian ethics, why we're here today. What have we not been teaching in our churches, in our congregations, about business practices, about ethical business that lead folks to think this is okay, that this type of lending is okay? And so we have to take some of the blame on ourselves as churches. Yeah. I want to piggyback off of that too, with specifically this example of Dr. Elijah Brown, who was at ETBU. And was it you that helped with the study on the campaign finance? So he and Taylor did a study on campaign contributions to Texas members of the Texas House and Senate from payday lenders. Right. This is open records. This is Texas Ethics Commission. These are things that are available. And it was amazing and discouraging at the same time. But the funny thing is, so he sent it to me, and we talked early on about it. And then, 5 months later, I've got friends in Washington that work on this issue all the time. They're sending it to me like, "Hey, did you see this? This is really good." I'm like, "Yeah, I did." And so all that to say, you might be surprised at what you're doing now and the things that you can come up with and ways you can work with the resources at a university can really make an impact. I mean, think about the towns where we're talking about: Brownwood, Marshall, Belton. If you have professors or presidents or people that are known in the community as leaders who help you and engage with it, you think that the local rep, either in the state or the national level, is not going to listen? If you walk in there with the president of a university or a dean of the seminary or a professor, these places where you are now are leaders in these communities, and certainly because they're huge employers and huge contributors to these smaller towns. And so be thinking, I think it applies both for the universities and the churches, that they should be we all should be seen as leaders in our community. And this is taking that seriously. To say that politics is one thing and faith is another, there's some truth to that in certain ways, but the ability for a congregation or a university to be a leader in the community is there, and we have to really know that and take advantage of that.
Other question? Well, let me check on it. I noticed was there any other school or university that's doing something that you're aware of, Well, maybe when you go back home, this might be something that's worth doing some investigating to see what's going on your campus, for example, if there's anything going on there. It might be good to try to set up a group like this that begins to make Christian ethics, because all of you are coming from a Christian-based university. It might be good to talk with some of your professors in your religion department and talk about this. And then, of course, I'm assuming probably all of you are connected with some church somewhere, and you may be even doing some responsibilities at the church, either as a staff person or as a volunteer, it might be good to start the conversation in your congregation as you go back home. But keep in mind that payday lending is a big one, but there may be, as Stephen told you, other issues that are out there that you're already involved in. So take this back with you. Any other questions that we have? Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think so either. Yes, from the very beginning, Dallas was the first, with first city. San Antonio was second. I've been with pastors in those cities in Austin who are testifying at the city council and that sort of thing. So most recently, Waco, the council member who passed the ordinance, his name is Dylan Meek. He's a brand new city councilman. He interned for the Texas Baptist Christian Life Commission when he was in college, and that's where he learned. He started, paying attention to this issue, and all the way to the point where he was sitting on the city council helping this. And so, I can connect you to those folks. We can look at who's on the city council in Abilene, see where they go to church and who their pastors might be. And the Texas Municipal League, TML, is the group of cities at the state legislature. They have been very active on this issue and encouraged people to adopt what they call the model ordinance. Absolutely. And so far they are exactly the same, which is part of the genius of them, is that they can't complain about having too many regulations when they're all the same. And so there's a long, political story of why that ended up the way it did. But so if you can kind of get to some council members, talk to them, encourage them. If you can, come with their pastor or talk to them from a place of faith, it might be particularly effective. But then say, look, this is not some Johnny-come-lately harebrained idea. This has been going on since 2011, I think it Dallas was, or maybe 2012. It's withstood several legal challenges. We would be the 33rd city or whatever it happens to be. TML is helping out, connect them to the people at TML. Then hopefully it can move forward. You bet. Yes. Yes, that's a really good question, because that one is very politically charged. Two things I'll mention. First of all, CBF has been involved to a certain degree with a coalition called the Evangelical Immigration Table. And again, this is sojourners from the far left progressive to the Southern Baptist ERLC, and a lot of people in between. So it shows a unity of faith perspective on this, which I think is helpful, and that's very biblically based, scripturally based. They can help folks articulate what they would consider a Christian ethical reading of Scripture when it comes to this issue. That's one thing. But for us, even more importantly, is the number of field personnel, missionaries, that CBF has working domestically in immigrant communities. When you're loving and ministering to some of the most marginalized and vulnerable populations, that's going to be a lot of folks who are undocumented. And so that has led to some very direct advocacy from some of our field personnel, because they felt called, not because we directed them to go do something, but because they felt so passionate about the situation of the people that they're with. And so we continue to stay pretty abreast of the issue and talk about it pretty frequently. We're having a conference in March called Advocacy in Action, and those field personnel are going to come tell their story of how mission work led to advocacy. That is one that is so contingent upon the political viability, that I think what we're going to be doing is educating and talking to people and continuing to lift this up as something that's important for a time when there might be some movement on it. And we've been pretty explicitly saying we think that there needs to be a comprehensive solution, that the EIT, Evangelical Immigration Table, has a set of principles that they want to say anything should have this, and a lot of it has to do with keeping families together and pathways to citizenship that we agree with based on the experience of those in the mission field. So I hope that helps a little bit. I would say go to EIT. They have a website that should be helpful, and there you might find some others. There's a really good book called Welcoming the Stranger that Jenny Yang wrote with, I think, Matthew Sorens maybe, and they're with, is it World Vision or World Relief? I can't remember. I was just with them last week, but I can't remember, get those confused. And that's a really good place to start. That goes back to, where do you begin? Maybe let's start on this one in particular with Scripture, with the Bible. And there's a lot of times, obviously, people use the Bible for all sorts of, to back up all sorts of things, to say whatever their own position. It's really difficult to find the Scripture that says treat the stranger badly, right? To welcome them, it's such a story of migration and people moving as they felt called, it really is difficult to come up with a real biblical-based solution to deporting 13 million people and separating children from their parents.
Don't forget that Jesus was a refugee for a while as a child in Egypt.
Last year we at this Advocacy and Action trip, which is every March, we had those folks, Greg and Sue Smith, come from the Lucha Ministries, and they brought, actually she went to Belton, I forget Ashley's last name, but she was from UMHB, but they also brought some kids in the community who were dreamers, who were brought when they were very, very young. We're in college right now. They helped get them into college, but once they graduated from college, they weren't going to have the work authorization. And they were part of our group, and we went to the White House and met with Melissa Rogers, who's a friend and who runs the faith-based and community partnerships with the White House. And they went back and wrote a blog called Dreamers at the White House. And it's beautiful, and it's really well done, so you can find that on the CBF blog.
Can I share something?
Yeah.
And I would recommend, as someone who works with a lot of undocumented immigrants, is really listen to their story with a very objective eyes and ears. Listen to their stories, why they're here, and the hope that they find here. When you can do that, I feel that you can do so much with advocacy. You become their voice. You want to be their voice once you know why. I think they can't start anywhere else but knowing why and their heart's desires to be here.
Absolutely. And I think one of the problems I think that we have in this country, and I try not to just totally say this sort of thing blatantly, but is the inability to empathize with the other. That there's so much when it comes to the political realm, and particularly that people are looking out for themselves and not thinking about what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And so this is one of those places when you sit down and hear somebody's story, and you ask yourself, what would you do to keep your family fed or safe? And so that's something really important. And I was with a group, ecumenical organization in Washington last week, and Jenny Yang presented on this, and a gentleman that was presenting with her said, we have a real open question in this country. Is America going to continue to be a beacon of hope, or are we going to turn into Fortress America? And he was referring specifically to the political candidates. And so I think it's important to institute a bit of empathy and understanding and some biblical and scriptural resources and reasoning behind that issue in particular.
Well, our time is up. I know that there is a sign-up sheet that Anera has on the back table there. Anera, real quickly tell what that sign-up sheet is for in case anyone of the group here would like to sign up for that.
Well, we have several things. We have some information, some flyers for you to learn more about advocacy and also about payday lending. And that sign-up sheet is so that you can get more information from us. We can direct you to either websites or more information, but most importantly, it's so that if you do have a story or you know somebody who has a story, that you can share that either with me or that you can go to the Consumer Finance Bureau Protection's website and write the story for them or help them with that. And it's also if you want to help me connect with your pastors or your faith community, so that we can do something together. So my charge to you is don't just take this information that you've learned today, but let's put it into action, whether that's in serious prayer and serious listening to others to see where they're coming from. Are they stuck in one of these loans? And actually doing something about it. And it could just be bringing awareness and wanting to know how to bring awareness.
And I do need to mention one other thing. I'd be remiss if not that Randy Nogbauer, who represents this area, kind of Lubbock to Abilene, is on the House Financial Services Committee, which sees this issue. He is also the chair of the Financial Institutions and the Consumer Credit Subcommittee, the very subcommittee that handles this issue. If you are concerned about this and feel like something good needs to happen, please call him and let him know that. He needs to hear from people in his district because, needless to say, he does not see it the same way as everyone in a church almost I've ever talked to. So he has not shown the same concern for reform as I would hope, and so he needs to hear from constituents. There was a hearing 2 weeks ago in that subcommittee. They had 7 witnesses called. Only one of them said that there needs to be some reform. Fortunately, it was a person of faith. It was Dr. Freddie Haynes with Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, who's been working with us on this issue for years. And so the only voice at a congressional hearing saying that something needs to be done came from a pastor. And we need to keep that in mind. And if you're concerned, then you're sitting in a really good place to make a difference.
Well, thank y'all for being here this afternoon with us. Anera also has some business cards back there, so she's a good contact for you on this payday lending issues here to network with, whether it's something on your campus or your church, all right? Let's stand and we'll dismiss with a word of prayer.